The shrill tone of a 911 call pierced the quiet early morning of Fox Hollow, a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. At 4:30 a.m., emergency responders rushed toward the source, a large, pristine two-story home on a neatly manicured street. The flashing lights of patrol cars painted the darkened streets in shades of red and blue, reflecting off wet pavement from an early morning rain. The scene, once calm and undisturbed, now buzzed with urgency and dread. As responders reached the front porch, the door stood partially open, hanging unevenly, as if it had been forced. Inside, chaos awaited. A living room in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, picture frames lay cracked, and shards of glass from a shattered vase glittered on the hardwood floor. In the midst of the wreckage lay a man, bloodied and visibly shaken, bound by rough cords at the wrists, and his eyes wide with shock. It was Alaric Draven, a private jet pilot known to the neighborhood for his charisma and confidence. The responders moved quickly, freeing his wrists and guiding him to safety. Alaric was covered in cuts, a nasty gash above his brow bleeding freely. His breathing was ragged, and his gaze was distant, seemingly unable to comprehend the chaos around him. From the living room, their attention was drawn upstairs. Footsteps pounded across the floorboards as the responders ascended, urgency pressing them forward. At the top of the stairs, the scene grew darker, more intense. The soft ambient light from the hallway revealed the devastation inside the master bedroom. Blood stained the pale carpet, and amidst the scattered jewelry and clothing lay the motionless form of Serafina Hale, Alaric's wife. She was sprawled across the floor, her once bright eyes now empty, staring up at the ceiling in a lifeless gaze. Blood pooled around her, seeping into the fibers of the carpet, a stark contrast to her pale, delicate features. Clutched in her right hand was a small-caliber revolver, its barrel smeared with blood, suggesting a struggle. The air felt heavy, the weight of the scene pressing down on those who witnessed it. In the corner of the room, the couple's young daughter, Elara, sat on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. She held a worn, stuffed rabbit, her tiny fingers gripping it tightly as tears streamed down her cheeks. A responder moved to scoop her up, cradling the child's fragile body with care. The room, once a place of supposed comfort, now felt like the echo of a nightmare that had bled into reality. Outside the house, the residents of Fox Hollow began to wake. Curious faces peered out from windows and stood huddled on porches, murmurs of confusion and disbelief rippling through the neighborhood. Fox Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong, where lawns were perfectly manicured, and where families like the Drevens were admired for their apparent perfection. But now, that facade had cracked wide open, and an undercurrent of unease settled over the community. Medical responders ushered Alaric out of the house and into a waiting ambulance, wrapping him in a blanket to ward off the chill of the early morning air. He seemed dazed, his movements slow and mechanical, as if guided by some distant, automatic instinct. His eyes remained fixed on the second-floor window, where his wife had died. The horror of the night etched into his expression. Detective Marshall Thorne, a veteran investigator known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, arrived on the scene shortly thereafter. His sharp eyes took in every detail: the shattered vase in the living room, the overturned furniture, the slight crack in the basement window that seemed out of place. Thorne's instincts sharpened as he absorbed the evidence, noting how the chaotic scene seemed almost too perfect, too staged. Something about it struck him as wrong, though he couldn't yet put his finger on what. As forensic teams began their meticulous work, photographing the scene and collecting samples, Thorne moved carefully through the house, noting every item that seemed out of place, every detail that felt intentional. He observed the smear of blood leading from the master bedroom to the staircase, the way the glass had scattered from the broken vase, and the barely disturbed drawers in the living room. The robbery, if that's what it had been, didn't seem to follow any logical pattern. Morning light began to seep into the house, casting a faint glow over the chaotic scene. The responders carried Serafina's lifeless body out of the house, carefully wrapped in a white sheet, her features hidden from the curious eyes of the onlookers. Thorne lingered in the doorway, watching as she was taken away, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. He knew, even then, that the case would be far more complicated than it appeared. The residents of Fox Hollow, once captivated by the Drevens' picturesque life, were left in stunned silence. Whispers grew louder, speculation spread, and rumors began to swirl. What kind of tragedy could tear apart a family that seemed so perfect from the outside? As Alaric sat quietly in the ambulance, lost in his own thoughts, He maintained the same distant, numb expression, seemingly detached from the devastation around him. Detective Thorne watched the paramedics close the ambulance doors, his mind already racing with unanswered questions. The crime scene, the evidence, and the strangely composed demeanor of the husband all pointed to a story that didn't quite make sense. As he turned back to the house, now marked off with yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze, he knew that the answers would not come easily. Whatever had unfolded in the Drevin household that night, it had shattered the illusion of perfection that Alaric had so carefully constructed. The truth, Thorne suspected, lay buried somewhere in the details. The faint bloodstains, the broken glass, and the subtle chaos that hinted at something far more sinister than a mere break-in. His investigation, he realized, was only just beginning. The days following the tragedy were filled with shock, mourning, and whispers. Alaric Drevin, the man who had once been the image of confidence and charm in Fox Hollow, now seemed a shell of his former self. He was the grieving widower, the devoted father left to care for his infant daughter alone, and the neighborhood was quick to surround him with sympathy. From the outside, Alaric's life had always seemed flawless. He was a private jet pilot, a career that spoke of adventure and success, a man who traveled in luxury while maintaining the allure of a refined, stable family man. His social media page had been carefully curated, photos of private jets, exotic vacations, and intimate family moments. And at the center of this curated life was Serafina Hale, the young artist with an ethereal beauty who had captured Alaric's heart with a single smile. The beginning of their love story was almost too perfect, the kind of romance that seemed destined to be documented and shared. They met at an exclusive art gallery in downtown Charleston, where Serafina, at just 19, was showcasing a collection of her paintings, abstract pieces full of light and color that seemed to capture the very essence of her vibrant spirit. Alaric, 8 years her senior, had been immediately captivated by her youthful energy and the delicate way she spoke about her work. He was charming, confident, and well-off, and Serafina, still dreaming of making a name for herself in the art world, was swept off her feet. Their courtship had been fast, marked by grand gestures that made Serafina the envy of her peers. There was the time Alaric rented a private helicopter, flying her over the Charleston skyline at sunset, the city's lights twinkling below them like stars. It was a night that would be immortalized on her social media, her windswept hair glowing with laughter, and his confident grin, arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. It was a perfect snapshot of a love that, to everyone watching, seemed destined for greatness. But beneath the surface, even in those early days, the cracks had already begun to form. Alaric was possessive, but it was subtle, a gentle concern that he veiled with words of care. He wanted to know where Serafina was, who she spent time with, what she was doing when they weren't together. At first, she thought it was romantic, a sign of his devotion, but over time, his questions became demands, and his presence felt more like a shadow that lingered, even when he wasn't there. Soon, they were inseparable. And when Serafina's art started gaining attention in local galleries, Alaric encouraged her to focus solely on her work, insisting that he would handle everything else. They moved in together to a secluded home in Fox Hollow, away from the city's distractions, where Serafina could dedicate herself to painting. The neighborhood was perfect, quiet, upscale, and removed from the prying eyes of strangers. Yet the isolation soon became a prison of its own. Months turned into years, and while Alaric's career thrived, allowing them to afford a luxurious lifestyle, Serafina's own ambitions seemed to fade. Her paintings, once filled with the colors of dawn and sunset, grew darker, more shadowed. Alaric encouraged her to stop showing her work publicly, urging her to keep her talents just for him, a private joy they could share away from the judgment of the art world. The neighbors in Fox Hollow noticed the change. Serafina, once vibrant and full of life, became more reclusive, appearing less frequently at local events and gatherings. When she did, she seemed distracted, quieter, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. It was easy to dismiss the pressures of being a young mother, some said, or perhaps the strains of living with a man as successful and driven as Alaric. But the whispers were there, faint and persistent, growing louder as time went on. Alaric, however, remained the perfect husband, at least in the eyes of the public. He organized charity events, attended local fundraisers, and was often seen jogging through the neighborhood with Alara in a stroller, greeting every passerby with a smile. But those who paid closer attention couldn't help but notice the tightness in his posture, the way he monitored Serafina's every move when they were together. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, an arm resting a bit too tightly on her shoulder, a smile that felt more like a warning than a reassurance. Then came the decision to elope, a surprise announcement that caught everyone off guard. There were no invitations, no lavish ceremony, just a quiet, private wedding on the Carolina coast with only a handful of witnesses. For Serafina's family, it was the first true sign that something wasn't right. Her parents, once close and involved in her life, found themselves increasingly shut out. They were given no explanation, only a brief invitation to visit the newlyweds' home in Fox Hollow, where the visit felt cold and rushed, full of pleasantries that masked a growing distance. Social media, however, told a different story, a fairy tale of love and prosperity. Photos of romantic dinners, vacations to secluded beaches, and moments of domestic bliss painted a picture of perfection that no one thought to question. The few remaining friends Serafina kept from her earlier life assumed she had simply moved on, happy and fulfilled in her new world. Yet, in the private confines of her diary, hidden away in the top drawer of her art studio, Serafina's true feelings bled onto the pages. The entries were sporadic, but each one revealed a little more of the life she was living behind closed doors. She wrote of Alaric's jealousy, his control over her choices, the way he had slowly but steadily pulled her away from everyone and everything she once knew. There were pages full of regret, sorrow and fear, uncertainty about the future and doubts about whether she had made the right choices. By the time Serafina became pregnant, any thoughts of leaving had vanished. The pregnancy, which had seemed like a blessing at first, only deepened the bond she felt toward Alaric, tying her more tightly to the life they had built together. Her diary became a confession of sorts, her love for Alara, her hope for a better future, and her growing anxiety about the man she had married. Those close to the Dravens in Fox Hollow noticed a subtle shift after Alara's birth. Serafina's social appearances all but ceased, and when she did appear, she seemed distant. Her eyes clouded with exhaustion and a sadness that she struggled to hide. Alaric, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in his role as a new father, presenting himself as the devoted husband and family man. He was careful, attentive, always ensuring that Serafina and Alara were well taken care of. Yet something about his care felt rehearsed, calculated. As the community continued to celebrate the Dravens' apparent happiness, no one could have imagined the storm brewing behind those closed doors, a storm that would eventually shatter the illusion of a perfect family, exposing the darker truths hidden in the shadows. The day had been calm and uneventful, a typical quiet evening in Fox Hollow, where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Alaric Draven had returned home from a business flight late in the afternoon, his demeanor collected as always, while Serafina had spent the day in her art studio, working on one of the moody, abstract paintings that had become her signature. The sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns, and the Draven house settled into a deceptive quiet as night fell. As the clock ticked toward midnight, a storm began to brew over Charleston, dark clouds gathering ominously in the sky. The rain started as a soft patter, growing heavier with each passing minute, until a steady downpour enveloped Fox Hollow. Inside the Draven household, the atmosphere was tense, thicker than the humid air outside. It was just past midnight when everything began to unravel. Serafina had been downstairs, tidying the kitchen, while Alaric lingered in the shadows of the living room, watching her with an intensity that felt almost predatory. The house was quiet, save for the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows and the occasional creak of floorboards underfoot. Then, without warning, the tension between them snapped. Serafina had noticed it, the subtle movements of Alaric's eyes, the way he hovered near the doorway, his gaze too focused and cold. She tried to ignore it, finishing up her tasks, but the feeling of being watched, scrutinized, became too overwhelming. A confrontation, long overdue, erupted between them. It started with harsh words, each accusation growing more heated and venomous. In the darkness of the living room, emotions boiled over. Then, Alaric made his move. In a sudden flash of violence, he produced a small revolver from the folds of his jacket, aiming it directly at Serafina. Shock flashed across her face, disbelief freezing her in place for a split second before survival instincts kicked in. She lunged, knocking the weapon from his grasp with a desperate strike. The gun hit the floor with a metallic clatter, skidding under the couch. Her training in martial arts, once a passion she hadn't pursued in years, returned in a blur of adrenaline. The fight that followed was a blur of fury and fear. Serafina struck back, her movements quick and defensive, her eyes wide with terror. Alaric, undeterred, grabbed a heavy glass vase from the mantel, a decorative piece that now became a weapon. He swung it with brutal force, shattering it against the side of Serafina's head. She staggered, blood streaming down her face, but still fought to stay on her feet, a primal urge to protect herself and her child fueling her every movement. But Alaric had planned for this. The rope, already prepared, was within arm's reach, tucked discreetly behind the couch. As Serafina struggled to regain her balance, he pounced, wrapping the cord around her neck in a sudden vicious motion. Her fingers clawed at the rope, her breaths coming in strangled gasps as she fought for air. The struggle was intense, desperate. She kicked, thrashed, her feet scrambling for purchase as she tried to break free. Her hands, slick with blood from the blow to her head, slipped uselessly against the tightening rope. It was over in minutes. Serafina's body went limp, her last gurgling breath silenced by the grip of the cord around her neck. Alaric released her, stepping back as her body crumpled to the floor. The room was silent, save for the heavy sound of his breathing and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. In the dim light, he watched the blood trickle from the wound on her forehead, mingling with the carpet fibers beneath her still form. There was no panic, no remorse, only cold calculation. He knew what he had to do next. The staging began. Alaric dragged Serafina's lifeless body upstairs, leaving faint trails of blood along the way. He laid her down carefully on the bedroom floor, arranging her limbs as if she had been overpowered by intruders. The gun was retrieved from under the couch, wiped clean, and placed delicately in her hand, a final touch to make the struggle appear more plausible. He moved quickly but deliberately, his mind racing to remember every detail of the story he had crafted. In the living room, he shattered more glass, creating an illusion of a violent break-in. He scattered drawers, overturned chairs, and carefully placed valuables to make it seem like desperate burglars had searched the house. A window in the basement was pried open from the inside, its lock snapped cleanly, another touch to make it look like the entry point of the intruders. To complete the illusion, Alaric reached for the rope again, this time using it on himself. He tied his wrists and ankles, just loose enough that he knew he could eventually wriggle free. Blood from Serafina's wound was smeared onto his own clothes, creating a grotesque picture of a man who had struggled and barely survived. His movements were methodical, precise. No detail was too small, no evidence overlooked. When everything was in place, he lay down on the living room floor, bound and gagged, waiting. The minutes crawled by, his mind numb with the weight of his actions. He used his nose to activate the voice assistant on his phone, managing to make the 911 call without using his hands. His voice trembled, his breathing heavy, but the words were exactly as he had rehearsed. By the time the responders arrived, the scene was set. They found him bloodied and tied up, the house in disarray, and Serafina's body upstairs, an apparent victim of a brutal home invasion. Alaric played the part of the shocked, grieving husband with precision, his face a mask of sorrow, as he watched them catalog the horror he had so carefully orchestrated. But as dawn broke and the crime scene tape fluttered in the early morning breeze, not everything was as perfect as he had believed. Tiny unnoticed details, traces of blood, mismatched timelines, and inconsistencies in the scene hinted at a story that was far from what it seemed, a story that would unravel piece by piece, under the careful eye of those determined to find the truth. The crime scene, now swarming with investigators, was meticulously photographed and documented. Forensic technicians combed through every inch of the Draven household, taking samples, swabbing surfaces, and collecting evidence. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, a smell that lingered as the house was turned upside down in search of answers. Detective Marshall Thorne was at the center of it all. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for catching even the smallest inconsistencies, Thorne stood in the middle of the living room, surveying the chaos. The scene told a story, but one that felt oddly disjointed, like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces forced into the wrong places. Alaric's account of a violent home invasion clashed with his own observations, and doubt gnawed at him as he began to piece together the narrative. Forensics quickly flagged several anomalies. The glass shards scattered across the floor didn't align with the struggle, as if they had been deliberately placed. Blood splatters, faint and barely visible to the naked eye, seemed inconsistent with the supposed sequence of events. There was no sign of forced entry, save for the basement window, its lock broken from the inside, suggesting a staged point of access. Thorne's instincts told him that this was no random burglary. The first interviews were routine, but revealing. Alaric's behavior during the initial questioning was disconcertingly calm. His recount of the night's events was precise, almost rehearsed. He spoke of masked intruders with steady detachment, his eyes dry and composed despite the tragedy that had unfolded. As he repeated the sequence, how they had stormed in, tied him up, and killed his wife upstairs, Thorne noted the measured pauses, the careful choice of words, and the lack of visible grief. Days after the incident, the investigation intensified. A forensic team dug deeper into the physical evidence, focusing on the basement window, the trail of blood leading upstairs, and the items left in disarray. Serafina's body underwent a detailed autopsy, and the results added more questions than answers. The pathologist noted that the bruising around her neck was consistent with strangulation, not with an impact from a struggle. Moreover, the wound from the broken vase, while significant, was not the cause of death. It had been the strangling, cold, deliberate, and methodical. Serafina's smartwatch became a critical piece of evidence. The data logs told a different story from Alaric's version. Her heart rate had spiked hours before he claimed the attack began. The data showed moments of elevated stress, then a sudden sharp drop-off at a time that didn't match Alaric's supposed timeline of the break-in. Thorne, poring over the digital data with an expert eye, recognized that technology didn't lie. It was a discrepancy he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the police canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to neighbors who had known the Drevens, however superficially. Most described the couple as private, aloof, and almost too perfect. Few had seen them together socially, and fewer still could recall Serafina leaving the house without Alaric. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, mentioned seeing lights on in the Draven household late at night, flickering as if someone had been pacing from room to room. Another remembered the distinct sound of glass breaking, but it had come hours before the supposed time of the home invasion. Back at the station, Thorne and his team began reconstructing the crime. They analyzed the scene over and over, studying the photographs, matching blood splatters with impact zones, mapping the exact path of movement through the house. Each time they reconstructed the sequence, more inconsistencies emerged. It wasn't just the broken glass or the disturbed furniture. It was the lack of forced entry, the meticulous placement of objects, the subtle hints of a staged event. The break-in, they concluded, had been orchestrated with the kind of precision that only someone familiar with the house could achieve. The discovery of Serafina's diary deepened the mystery. Hidden away in her art studio, the diary was filled with personal reflections that painted a starkly different picture of the Draven marriage. The entries were sporadic, some cheerful, others filled with sorrow and doubt. The later entries, written in shaky, desperate handwriting, spoke of feeling trapped, of a man who had become more controlling with each passing day. The final pages were almost a play, a half-finished thought about wanting to leave, about taking Alara and starting over, far away from Fox Hollow. There was fear in those words, a fear that felt painfully prophetic. Detective Thorne knew he needed more. The diary, while revealing, was not conclusive evidence. He needed something definitive, something that would unravel the carefully woven fabric of Alaric's story. The focus turned to digital forensics, Serafina's phones, Alaric's devices, and the home's security system. The phone logs showed that Serafina had tried to call a friend the night she died, a call that had never connected. She had left a series of unsent messages, drafts saved but never sent, detailing her plans to leave. One message, time-stamped just hours before her death, hinted at a confrontation with Alaric, a desperate attempt to stand up to him that, based on the timeline, had never come to pass. Alaric's own phone revealed more damning evidence. In the days leading up to Serafina's death, his search history included articles on home break-ins, insurance claims for theft, and, most unsettling of all, guides on staging a crime scene. There were no direct admissions of guilt, but the intent was clear to anyone looking closely enough. One piece of evidence remained, the missing footage from the home's security system. The cameras, mounted discreetly around the house, had been wiped clean of the crucial hours on the night of the murder. It was a deliberate deletion, not the work of careless intruders. Yet, the system logs revealed that the footage had been removed well before Alaric claimed the break-in occurred, raising the stakes even higher. With every piece of evidence, the story began to shift. Alaric, once a model of confidence, now became the prime suspect in what looked increasingly like a staged crime. His narrative, the tale of masked intruders and a violent home invasion, was crumbling under the weight of data, testimony, and forensic analysis. It was no longer a question of what had happened, but of why and how far he had gone to construct the perfect lie. Thorne, unrelenting, prepared for the next phase of the investigation. The evidence, now carefully catalogued, was pointing in a single, inevitable direction, but he knew that confronting Alaric too soon would be a mistake. The man was calculated, careful, and unlikely to crack under ordinary pressure. Thorne needed an edge, something that would break through the layers of deception that Alaric had woven so skillfully. It would take time, patience, and a deep understanding of the psychology at play. For Thorne, the game was only beginning, and the stakes were growing higher with each new revelation. He was determined to expose the truth, even if it meant tearing apart the carefully maintained illusion that had kept Fox Hollow in the dark for so long. The investigation, far from ending, had only begun to uncover the dark undercurrents beneath the Draven household's perfect facade. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Alaric's version of events, and Thorne could feel the case tightening around the suspect, like the noose that had silenced Seraphina's final breath. The investigation's momentum grew with each passing day. Detective Thorne and his team meticulously sifted through every scrap of evidence, looking for the threads that would tie everything together. The more they uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. But gaps remained, lingering questions that begged for answers. Thorne knew that if they were going to crack this case, they needed to understand the psychology behind the facade Alaric had built. One of the first breakthroughs came with the analysis of Seraphina's smartwatch and Alaric's phone data. The discrepancies between their timelines were stark. The smartwatch had recorded Seraphina's heightened heart rate at a time that didn't align with the supposed break-in, suggesting that the confrontation had begun much earlier than Alaric claimed. A forensic expert confirmed that the device had accurately captured Seraphina's last moments, recording a sudden violent spike in her stress levels before her heartbeat abruptly ceased. The digital evidence pointed to something even more damning: Alaric's movements. His phone's GPS tracker, embedded in a fitness app, had logged steps that contradicted his own testimony. During the hours he claimed to be tied up and helpless, the phone showed him moving throughout the house. This inconsistency was glaring, a sign that the story he had told, so carefully rehearsed, was beginning to fall apart under scrutiny. Forensic specialists continued to analyze the scene, focusing on the physical elements that had initially seemed innocuous. The blood patterns, previously overlooked, revealed a disturbing truth. The spray from the shattered vase and the trail leading to the staircase didn't match the timeline Alaric described. Instead, it suggested that the struggle had occurred not during a frantic break-in, but in a calculated, premeditated confrontation. The vase shards, analyzed under a microscope, showed traces of Seraphina's blood and fingerprints that seemed to indicate she had grabbed it in a desperate attempt to defend herself. Meanwhile, Thorne's team conducted a deeper investigation into Alaric's background. His financial records, which had appeared solid on the surface, revealed hidden debts and financial troubles that painted a picture of desperation. Unpaid loans, gambling losses, and recent inquiries about life insurance policies on Seraphina had been buried under layers of seemingly legitimate business expenses. The image of the wealthy, successful pilot began to crumble, revealing a man cornered by debt and the fear of losing control. Seraphina's diary provided another invaluable lead. The entries, now transcribed and cross-referenced with other evidence, painted a picture of a woman who felt increasingly isolated and trapped. Her words revealed a growing fear of Alaric's temper, his tightening grip on her life, and a desperate desire to escape before it was too late. One of the final entries was haunting in its simplicity. She wrote of an impending confrontation, of needing to take a stand for herself and for Alara. The last line, incomplete and abruptly cut off, suggested that she never got the chance. As the evidence piled up, the pressure to confront Alaric mounted. Thorne, however, was cautious. He knew that the facade Alaric had constructed wouldn't be easy to break. The man was cold, calculating, and had shown no signs of slipping under the weight of his wife's death. A direct confrontation, without the necessary leverage, could risk driving him further into denial. It was then that Thorne decided to shift his focus from Alaric to the environment that he controlled so tightly, the house itself. For weeks, the Draven household had been considered a closed case in terms of forensic analysis. But Thorne had a gut feeling that they had missed something critical. A second sweep of the property was organized, and this time focusing on the small, hidden spaces often overlooked during a cursory investigation. In the basement, tucked behind a loose panel in the wall, the team discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a black duffel bag filled with odd, disjointed items: duct tape, zip ties, disposable gloves, and a burner phone. The discovery was incriminating, a collection of tools that spoke of planning, not improvisation. The burner phone, in particular, became a priority for analysis. Its contents were sparse, but a few deleted messages and call logs to unknown numbers painted a picture of a man planning for contingencies, preparing for the worst. This discovery added weight to Thorne's suspicion that Alaric's tale of the home invasion was a premeditated cover story. The rope found at the scene, the gun placed in Seraphina's hand, the stage disarray, it all pointed to someone who had taken the time to carefully construct a false narrative. The duffel bag was proof that this was no spur-of-the-moment decision. It was cold, deliberate, and precise. The detectives decided it was time to confront Alaric with the evidence they had gathered. They summoned him to the station for another round of questioning, this time armed with the digital discrepancies, the diary entries, and the physical evidence that no longer matched his story. As Alaric arrived, his demeanor was as confident as ever, his suit impeccable, his face expressionless. He sat across from Thorne in the sterile, windowless interrogation room, a table separating them like a chasm. The questioning was methodical, calm, and relentless. Thorne laid out the evidence piece by piece, starting with the simplest inconsistencies before moving into the more damning details. The smart technology logs, the forensic contradictions, the financial distress. Each new revelation was met with the same detached response from Alaric. He denied, deflected, and dodged, his calmness unnerving even to the seasoned detectives watching from behind the mirrored glass. But then Thorne played his final card. He presented Alaric with the contents of the duffel bag, spreading them out on the table one by one. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Alaric's eyes, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Thorne pressed harder, revealing the burner phone's incomplete data logs and the messages that hinted at premeditation. The mask was cracking, the calm demeanor fraying at the edges. Yet, Alaric didn't break. His denials grew sharper, his composure more brittle. But he refused to admit to anything, clinging to the story he had told since the beginning. Thorne knew he needed more, something irrefutable that would tear through the carefully maintained web of lies. The recording from Serafina's phone was analyzed once more. And buried deep within the digital noise was a fragment of audio that no one had noticed before. A faint but distinct sound of Alaric's voice, barely audible, saying her name in a tone that was not of fear, but of rage. It was enough. Thorne moved forward with a search warrant for Alaric's office, digging into the financial records that had hinted at deeper secrets. In a locked drawer, they found a series of receipts, payments to private investigators, transactions for surveillance equipment, and most damning of all, a document detailing a contingency plan for what he called domestic disruptions. It was all there, laid out in black and white, a paper trail of a man who had orchestrated his wife's death with chilling precision. The walls were closing in on Alaric. Thorne had the evidence, and he knew it. It was no longer a question of if Alaric would be charged, but when, and whether he would finally reveal the truth, or maintain the lie until the very end. The investigation had revealed the darkness behind the facade of a perfect life, and the stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine Alaric's fate. Detective Thorne knew he had Alaric cornered. The evidence, now undeniable, painted a picture of premeditated murder, calculated and carefully executed. With the weight of the investigation bearing down on him, Thorne decided to make the final move. Alaric's facade was cracking, but he needed one last push to break through the wall of lies. Thorne and his team prepared meticulously, analyzing every detail before bringing Alaric in for what they hoped would be the final confrontation. Alaric arrived at the station, his demeanor cool, his expression one of barely concealed irritation. This time, he was escorted not to the sterile interview room, but to a larger, more intimidating space, the kind reserved for suspects in high-profile cases. The evidence was laid out in front of him, meticulously presented, each piece more damning than the last. There was no room for escape, no space left for excuses. The timeline discrepancies, the financial records, the hidden duffel bag, and the psychological manipulation. It all pointed to the truth Alaric had tried so desperately to hide. As the pressure mounted, the cold mask he had worn for weeks began to fracture. Thorne spoke with a deliberate calm, laying out the sequence of events with clinical precision. The sound of Serafina's name, captured on the fragmented recording, played in the room, its barely audible tone striking a deep, nerve-wracking chord in Alaric's carefully constructed facade. The hidden compartment in the basement, the staged break-in, the insurance claims. It was all too much for even Alaric to deny. Hours passed as Thorne pressed harder, each new detail forcing Alaric to retreat further into a corner. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment came. The cracks gave way, and Alaric's composure shattered. He broke down, not with tears, but with a cold, detached rage. The confession came out not as an apology or a plea for forgiveness, but as a justification, a twisted rationale for why he had done what he did. Alaric admitted to everything. He described, in chilling detail, the confrontation with Serafina, the moment he had decided that she could not be allowed to leave, her plans to escape, her growing defiance. Her refusal to play the role he had crafted for her were, in his mind, a betrayal. He had planned the break-in meticulously, choosing every detail with care to ensure that it would look like a violent, tragic accident. His voice was flat as he described the final moments, the vase shattering against her skull, the rope tightening around her neck, and the cold realization that he felt nothing as the life drained from her eyes. It was control, he explained, that had driven him, a need to maintain the perfect image he had built for himself no matter the cost. Serafina's death, in his twisted logic, was a necessary act to preserve the facade of his own success. Thorne listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He knew that this wasn't a confession born out of remorse, but out of defeat. Alaric's pride, his arrogance, had led him to believe that he could outsmart the system, but he had been wrong. The truth was now out, and the consequences would be inescapable. The courtroom was packed. Media crews, legal experts, and the curious public filled every available seat as Alaric Draven's trial became a spectacle of sensational intrigue. The image of the once perfect family had been shattered, and the truth behind the facade was now a matter of public record. The trial began with a somber recounting of the facts, each piece of evidence meticulously presented, each witness recounting their observations with careful precision. The prosecutors laid out the timeline of events, supported by the forensic analysis that had dismantled Alaric's version of the story. The diary entries were read aloud, detailing Serafina's growing fear and sense of entrapment, her desire to leave, and her final unfinished thoughts. The damning financial evidence showed Alaric's motive, debts, financial pressure, and a life insurance policy that became a key focus of the prosecution's case. Detective Thorne was called to the stand, recounting the investigation with cold clarity. He described the inconsistencies in Alaric's narrative, the manipulation of the crime scene, and the digital trail that had led them to the truth. Thorne's testimony was methodical, his delivery steady, never embellishing, but never holding back. The defense tried to paint a different picture, attempting to shift the blame onto Serafina, suggesting that her mental state, her volatile emotions, and her desire to leave had provoked Alaric into a moment of irrational violence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Each claim was dismantled by expert witnesses, each argument undercut by the cold, hard facts of the case. Alaric's own words, his detached and unrepentant confession, became the linchpin of his downfall. It took the jury less than 2 hours to deliberate. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and insurance fraud. Alaric stood expressionless as the judge delivered the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There were no outbursts, no last-minute confessions or desperate pleas. Alaric remained as cold and detached as he had been from the start. A man who had once fooled everyone, now unmasked before the world. In the months that followed, the story faded from the headlines, but the scars left behind remained. Serafina's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, found solace in raising Alara, who would never know the true story of the tragedy that had taken her mother's life. The Draven house, once a symbol of suburban perfection, was sold and remained empty, a hollow reminder of the darkness that had once resided there. Detective Thorne moved on to other cases, but the memory of Serafina's death lingered in the back of his mind. It was a case that had tested him, challenged his instincts, and shown him the depths of human deception. The investigation had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a cost: an innocent life lost, and a child left to grow up without her mother. Years later, on the anniversary of the trial, Thorne visited the grave where Serafina Hale was buried, a simple bouquet of white lilies in hand. He stood silently, remembering the young woman whose voice had been silenced, and the child who had survived. The case was over, the truth had been revealed, but the questions it left behind, about control, manipulation, and the darkness that could hide behind a perfect smile, remained. As he walked away from the grave, Thorne knew that there would always be other cases, other stories to uncover, but he would never forget the night he had seen through Alaric Draven's lies, nor the lengths to which one man had gone to preserve an illusion of perfection at the cost of everything he claimed to love. The truth, he realized, was sometimes as fragile as the lives it could destroy, a delicate web that could unravel with a single lie, a single betrayal, or a single moment of desperate rage. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.